The topic of this video is the false claims made by J.D. Vance and other Republicans that the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 caused problematic inflation occurring prior to the passage of the act, contributed to inflation before any money was spent pursuant to the act, and is a major cause of the benign inflation that the U.S. now has. The government reported last Friday that personal consumption expenditure inflation rose 2.2% over the 12 months ending in August of 2024, which was lower than the consensus forecast. The annual rate of PCE inflation through July 2024 was reported at 2.5%, so the annual rate of personal consumption expenditure inflation is decreasing at a rapid rate now. The PCE price index is favored by the Federal Reserve over the Consumer Price Inflation Index, or CPI. The 10-year tip break-even inflation rate closed last Friday at 2.15%. That is the market's estimate of the annual average CPI over the next 10 years. That is what has historically been viewed as benign inflation and is below the 3.3% average annual inflation rate for the U.S. economy since the government started to compile CPI data in 1913, and that goes through 2023. I sourced that historical data from the Trading Economics website. The Minneapolis Fed has a website listing the annual inflation rates starting in 1914. The Fed was comfortable enough with inflation now that it cut the federal funds rate by 50 basis points last week. Forecasts for real GDP growth in the 2024 third quarter made by the Atlanta Fed's GDP forecasting model is currently at 3.1%. That is a real GDP growth number, which is hardly consistent with Trump's claim that the U.S. is failing and falling deeper into third world economic status, which only he can turn around. That kind of claim may actually work on uninformed, middle-aged, or older folks who have failed economically in their life entirely or mostly due to their own actions, which they will not take responsibility for and seek to blame the government or anyone but themselves. The reason for bringing this data up is that it relates to the false claims made by J.D. Vance and other Republicans that the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, signed into law in August of 2022, caused or contributed to the problematic inflation numbers that occurred prior to the passage of the act or any spending authorized by the act. Vance made this kind of false claim in remarks in Sparta, Michigan on September 16, 2024, in Raleigh, North Carolina on September 18, 2024, in Leesport, Pennsylvania on September 21, 2024. Another Republican, Tim Sheehy, I may mispronounce that, Sheehy, the former Navy SEAL running against Tester for the Senate seat in Montana, claimed in an X message that this act, quote, increased inflation and drove prices sky high, end quote. He at least has ignorance as an excuse. I don't think he really knows much about anything that involves national economic policy. But J.D. Vance does not have that excuse. He is just lying. Both the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan number crunchers for Congress, and Penn Wharton, as Vance is aware, concluded that this act would have no statistically significant impact on inflation for the 5 years ending in 2026. There would be some disinflationary impact from lower drug prices negotiated by Medicare that were authorized by the Act starting in 2026. The CBO also estimated that the Act would reduce the budget deficit. Inflation started to turn down in 2023 after this act was passed. The spending and tax credits authorized by the act occur over a 10-year period. This law was, as Vance pointed out, passed by the Senate with Harris casting the deciding vote. It was strictly on party line. All the Republicans voting against the law, all Democrat senators voting for it, and then Harris cast the deciding vote. So Vance wants to tie her to inflation by linking inflation to the Inflation Reduction Act. Facts are, of course, irrelevant to him in establishing that purported link. What Vance and Trump are really doing is that they don't like the Inflation Reduction Act tax incentives for clean energy projects, which is why both of them want to repeal the act. Their position is not based on principles, in my opinion, but as payback for coal and energy company campaign contributions. Using the false narrative that the act caused inflation is simply the excuse for repealing it. You do not have to dig very deep to see the reason why Vance and Trump want to repeal the act, and it has nothing to do with the act causing inflation. Since Vance is in favor of repealing this act, it is only fair that the benefits that will be bestowed on Ohio be withdrawn now, including the $500 million grant, which has not yet been handed over to Cleveland-Cliffs, a steel manufacturer, to build a hydrogen-fueled furnace for its steel plant in Middletown, Ohio, which will reduce emissions by 1 million tons a year, replacing coal as the fuel source. Note that the money has not yet been spent, so a question for Vance is how that spending that will occur in the years to come contributed to problematic inflation in 2021 and 2022, or to inflation now, which is considered benign by all economists. France called this clean energy projects a green scam that shipped jobs to China. When he makes those remarks, the Trumpsters cheer and applaud when they should be booing him for making deliberate efforts to deceive them with false information. My thought is to give Vance what he wants and repeal all the funding of green energy projects planned in Ohio and redirect the funds to projects in other states that vote for Harris in November. Like Trump, whose latest grifts include selling $100,000 watches and silver coins bearing his likeness. Vance will also make false claims that have no factual foundation and are just absurd. The act also authorized Medicare to negotiate drug prices. The first negotiation for the first 10 drugs has finished, with prescription drug costs for those drugs being lowered. If the new negotiated prices had been in effect in 2023, Medicare would have saved $6 billion, and beneficiaries under Part D, Medicare would have saved $1.5 billion in out-of-pocket expenses. So maybe Vance needs to be asked by someone how that contributes to inflation. I have cited references to my statements made in this video in the More section below.